Yes, ma'am.
The dots are like two different colors, like XR and are like swapped. Like they're opposite from your graph. And everyone I've talked to has had this.
Okay, so it must be an error in how I use it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine.
Is that the fix?
Okay, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about deliverable 4. A good comment was just brought up. I forget your name.
Lily.
Lily. Okay, Lily pointed out that there must be an error in the instructions for deliverable 4 because the color of the edge is the color of the face of the dot for you guys and vice versa, right? Everyone seems to be having this problem. Okay, then let's see. Leave it as is, so there's least confusion. Just submit it, and I'll tell the TA so that he knows to accept it as either face and edge or edge and face. So it doesn't matter if you get it one way or the other, as long as it's consistent. Make sense? Okay, and I will go back through the instructions and fix it for next year. Any other questions about deliverable 4? So far, so good. Anyone completed it yet? Couple people. Okay. All right. So again, deliverable 4 is short, but relatively short. But there's quite a few new concepts. So be sure not to leave it till the night before. Okay. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about what's going on in our heads, or at least the very small part of that has anything to do with HCI. We spent a lot of time on Tuesday talking about mental models. And I tried to ground that conversation for you by showing you my evil starfish robot and how that robot forms mental models of, in that case, itself. So unlike with humans and animals, we can actually look inside the brain of that robot and know exactly what it's doing. We can actually look at the mental model and see, is the mental model correct? Is it incorrect? That sort of thing. Obviously, with humans, we don't have that luxury. But be assured that your user will be creating a model of your interactive system as they interact with it, and they're going to be using that mental model to do what? Why does the brain spend so much time making models of the world around it? Sorry?
To help it when it gets different input.
Okay, we can be a little more specific than that.
To make a prediction.
To make a prediction, right? So I can immediately do something that'll capture your attention. You know that your sensory input is changing. That's different from being able to make a prediction, right? Prediction has to do with time. If I do this, I think in a short time in the future, I'm going to get this response. I've mentioned this many times. Especially the human brain, it's a prediction machine. We're making predictions about what happens when we interact with the physical world all the time. We make predictions about when I ask a question, how long I should wait to get an answer before I predict that maybe you don't actually know what the answer is. So we're making mental models about others all the time and their mental state. What do they know? What do they not know? What do they believe? And so on. You have decades of experience making these kind of mental models about the physical world and about your social world, and you can't help bringing those mental models to bear on interactive systems. Right at the beginning of the course, I gave you this example from the Wii remote video game where you shoot a bow and arrow. They're very specific predictions that your brain is making when it hears the arrow leave the bow and hearing it a short time later thunk into the target at the computer and so on, right? So be aware of what those predictions and expectations are that your user is likely to make. make your system in such a way that they can easily build up that mental model and start to make predictions. Oh, I'm always finding this functionality in this part of the menu hierarchy. So for this new functionality, I'm pretty sure it's going to be at this place in the menu hierarchy. Help them build a mental model and make sure that you're not breaking their expectations or their predictions unless you have a very good reason. Right? Okay, so we're going to pick up partway through Lecture 9 today, and then we'll move into Lecture 10 when we're going to talk about 3 aspects of cognition which support your brain's ability to make a mental model. We're going to talk about memory, attention, and perception. And when we talk about these 3 cognitive processes, we're going to be very, very careful. And I'm going to give you an example to show why we have to be very careful when we talk about memory, attention, and perception. If you haven't figured it out by now, I love robots. I find a way to work robots into every conversation or every lecture, so par for the course. I'm going to try and drive home this point about memory, attention, and perception by showing you this robot that was created by one of my graduate students just a few weeks ago. You just pause this robot for a moment. There's 2 things I want you to take away from this video. The first one is something we've already talked about, which a good visualization, or in this case, a good animation, hopefully doesn't require a lot of explanation. So I'm going to ask you to explain what this robot is and how it does what it's doing. And then we're going to talk about the memory, attention, and perception capabilities of this robot. Okay. What is this robot doing? Yes?
It sweeps back and forth and then tries to find an object that has the closest link to it, closest vector, I guess, to it, and then moves to that object.
Okay, so it's searching for these objects, and when it breaks one of the lines, it goes towards that object? Yep.
It seems to take into account the output, where they're going, but also how fast they're moving.
Okay.
Which one comes first?
Which one comes first, right? So this is like the old Space Invaders or Centipede video games, right? Capture the object before it hits the ground. You'll notice that some objects fall faster than others. What do you think those lines are that are emanating out of the side of our little cart robot here? Owen. Proximity sensors. So these are rays that are being sent out. You can think of them as lasers or what have you. When they're broken, the robot knows there's something there. Okay. So our robot has limited perceptual abilities. It doesn't have eyes. It doesn't have a live video feed of what's going on around it. All it has is this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 proximity sensors. So at every time step, our robot is getting back just 10 numbers, unlike leap motion, which is getting back 120 numbers every time step. Right? So that's the robot's perception. Let's talk now about this robot's cognitive abilities. So it can perceive. You know a little bit about how it perceives the world. What about? Yep.
Well, looks like it also, even once a disk is left, it's like sensor range. Like right here, it's the right one's out of the range, but it must remember that it's there, so it moves back to the right.
It must remember, right? So without writing memory anywhere, you can kind of infer by watching what it does, it's extremely likely that it has memory. Either that or it got really, really lucky. So there's definitely perception here. There's definitely memory here. What's the third one?
It can focus on an object.
It can focus on an object, right? So attention, we're going to talk about that today. What can you tell me about the attention capabilities of this robot? How do you know which of the 2 objects, if any, it's attending to or paying attention to?
They can tell which one is coming faster, because if they come at the same time and then one speeds up, it like moves to that one and then goes to the other one.
Exactly. So you'll see it at the beginning when it's quote unquote not sure. It figures out which one is coming faster and pays attention to it, right? So I'm putting these air quotes around all these cognitive terms. Does the robot really remember? Does it pay attention to one object or the other? How do we know at any point in time whether it's actually paying attention to 0, 1, or 2 of these objects? When we talk about the brains of these robots, as we're doing, we instinctually talk about them, or I'm helping you to talk about them as separate things. The memory of the robot, its attention capabilities, its perception of the world. This robot that my student made, if you crack it open and look inside at the brain, it's a very, very simple brain. It's got a brain that's no more complicated than a fruit fly. But there is no memory component. There is no attention component. There is no perception component. There aren't these modules like you'd find if you open up a computer and find the memory and the CPU and the battery and so on. So we talk about these cognitive capabilities as separate things. But at least in this simple robot, you can't point to any one part of the robot's brain and say, that's memory, or that's attention, or at this point in time, it's attending to this object. We're just watching the behavior, and it gives a lot of behavior that's evocative of these sorts of things. Same thing goes for humans, right? He remembered, he forgot. He recognized that icon from another application. The user is trying to pay attention to too many things at once, and they're getting distracted. Air quotes around all of those things, right? That's our normal way of talking about someone's cognitive processes, but we're really not sure about what's actually going on in the human brain when we talk about those things. So we have to be very careful when we talk about cognitive capabilities. Okay, we'll see that as we continue on through lecture 10 today. But let's go back to lecture notes 9. We were on slide 7, or I just backed up a little bit, and we were talking about how an agent or how a user actually builds up a mental model. So how do they build up a mental model? Well, they do it by playing with the new smartphone or waving their hand over leap motion and watching what's happening on the screen, right? Dewey told us, act first and observe the sensory repercussions. That's all well and good, but if your goal is to build up a mental model, what should you actually do? How should you move your hand to figure out where the edge of sight is for the leap motion device? So. And we also have an issue with when I do something, I see something happen on the screen. Did that happen on the screen because I moved my hand? Did it happen because I clicked something on the keyboard a second before? How do I know for the given whatever I currently perceive from the system, how do I know what action caused it? So typically your user, again without knowing it, as they're learning your system, they're trying to cross these two gulfs, the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation, and a well-designed interface will help the user cross these gulfs. Maybe you have a short animation with a waving hand when your user starts up your leap motion device, so they have at least an idea about what to do to get started. Go like this over the device. Once you do that, you see a hand that's waving in real time, or hopefully lagged not too much behind the actual waving hand, and people will immediately be able to interpret that perception. Wow, this device is seeing my hand in real time and reporting it to the screen. Okay, so we ended last time by I was just talking you through how the robot crosses these two gulfs. That's just there as an example. I won't repeat that one. Okay, so again, now we're starting to get into talking about these human cognitive processes. And at the top of the slide here, I say human cognitive processes are not hierarchical and serial. How do I know? Right? Again, we now have to be careful. They don't seem to be hierarchical and serial. Our cognitive processes seem to be more parallel. They operate on different time scales and at different levels. Right? So whenever you move about in the real world, you're getting sensory repercussion back at different time scales. As I'm waving my arm, I feel the weight of the watch on my hand changing as I move around. There's almost near real-time sensory motor feedback going on with my watch, which if I'm used to wearing my watch, I'm not attending to or paying attention to. While I'm doing that, I'm talking and I'm looking at your faces to see whether you're taking in what I'm saying, right? So there's also a slower social feedback loop that's going on in parallel, right? And again, this is something we do all the time, but it's hard to think about it that way, but that's what your user is doing as well. They're using your system to learn ASL, and in the back of their mind, they're building up a mental model of how well they're learning ASL. Is your system worth using? Are they actually getting better at that? While they're sort of involved in thinking about this slow sensor motor feedback loop with leap motion over minutes or hours, they're also obviously watching as they do this. Is the system recognizing is it recognizing my gesture? So how long should the user wait to get a signal back from the system that it's recognized the gesture? You're going to help them build up that mental model. Is your system going to recognize the gesture in real time and say 0, 1, 2, or perhaps it's waiting a little bit and it's giving back feedback after a second or 2 seconds? Then you have the real-time loop, right? People are moving their hands and seeing the actual hand on the screen move in real time. Your user is at least at some level of consciousness paying attention to all these different feedback loops that are going on in parallel, but at faster or slower timescales. What are some interactions you've had with software or websites or other technology where you're willing to wait milliseconds to seconds, but no more? And what are other interactions where you're willing to wait seconds, maybe not all the way up to years, but hours or minutes or days? Yes?
For an installation of software, you're usually willing to wait quite a while.
Absolutely, right? So at least most of us are still willing to allow some installations to be offline, right? Let it go and then go get a cup of coffee and come back. I don't know how long that expectation will hold up. We'll see how things go, right? We're still willing to wait for installation for quite a while. Yep. What about at the opposite end of the scale? What are things where you'll only tolerate real time? And any deviation from real time?
Video streaming.
Video streaming, yes, very good one. Yep. What else? Browsing, okay. We're at real-time browsing now, huh? No load whatsoever, okay. What else?
Dragging icons.
Dragging an icon, right? So I move something, I expect to see something move. A laggy mouse is one of the most frustrating things you can have, right? What about intermediate things? So installation, okay. Offline, I go get a cup of coffee, move the mouse, I expect real time. What are things where you're willing to wait, a few seconds? You're still in a real-time interaction, but you're willing to wait a little bit.
IDE or package opening.
Okay, yeah, maybe you're willing to wait, yeah. Might give it a little bit less than real-time threshold.
A large file and doing a backup or something.
Okay, doing a backup or moving a large file.
Connecting a new device.
Connecting a new device, right? Let the computer think for a little bit, but again, you're waiting to see whether it recognizes the device or not. Okay, we could think of a lot of these things, and again, you have different expectations about these. Some of them you're more strict with the amount of time you're willing to wait than others, but all of these expectations are coming down from one year to the next, right? When I send an email to my grad students, I don't expect them to respond immediately. I would love if they did, but it's a social interaction, right? Even if they get the email right after I sent it, they need some time to think about it and send back a response, right? Most social interactions, we're willing to wait a little bit. What are some social interactions that we enter into that we expect real-time feedback? We're doing it right now. Not waiting for a question, because that's taking a little bit.
Telling a joke.
What's that?
Telling a joke.
Telling a joke, and at least I hope you smile or something. Yeah, that's right. Takes too long to get the joke. Okay. What else? We haven't talked about Skype and real-time video chatting yet, but Skype and all the rest of them break one of our expectations of real-time social feedback. What is it? Real-time face-to-face feedback. That's Skype or Google Chat or none of these is able to accomplish. Again, we're doing it right now. Okay, right, so back to time scale. What about, but real time? Things that even if it was in real time with Skype or these other video chats, they still can't do, no matter how fast they are. What's that?
Put you in the same location.
Put you in the same location, all right. They try and cast the illusion that you're in the same location, but they can't quite do it because there's one expectation you have of a real-time face-to-face interaction that they cannot get right. No? Maybe you've all gotten used to it. You don't even know what's happening. Eye contact, right? I can tell a lot by how much you're attending to what I'm saying by eye contact, right? Or you're very good at fooling me one way or the other. Why can't Skype do eye contact? Why can't you lock eyes with someone in the Skype window? The webcam is not in the right position, right? If they could embed the webcam right in the center of the screen, then I guess you could do it, right? That doesn't frustrate anyone? Maybe you guys are all used to it by now, right? Yes?
I actually make a lot of Skype calls where I used to.
Okay.
And whenever I had something really important to say, I would just look away from the screen and stare at the camera.
Aha, yes, right? I'm making a point and I'm going to look you in the eyes while I do it, even though I'm not really looking you in the eyes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so again, your users have these expectations, and unfortunately on Skype you can't satisfy this one. How many of them can you satisfy given what you're trying to do? Okay. Mental models. The human brain is one of the most miraculous objects in the universe, but it's not perfect. We have a hard time running simulations internally. So you use your mental models to predict if you're interacting with the system, what's going to happen in the next second or so, right? If you're watching a video on your computer and it's a little laggy, you're making predictions about what you're going to see given what you've seen so far. But running things forward in time is very difficult, right? I see this, if I do this, then it will do this, and if I do that, it will do this. It's like playing mental billiards, right? It's very hard to predict where balls will go once one ball hits another ball and another ball. It's just a difficult thing to predict at all. Our brains are just not very good sequential processors. So most of our predictions are very, very short term, right? I'm moving my hand and I expect to see my hand enter my visual field. I'm making short-term predictions. Humans are not too bad at predicting further into the future for approximate things. I RSVP to a UVM event next week. I expect that I'll be there, the event will still happen. I can make predictions about things that are going to happen far in the future, but not the specific details, right? So don't expect your user to build up a mental model and remember or be able to predict when the system does this, that the user should move like this, which means the system will do this, and. Right? Mental models degrade, people forget things. Our mental models are affected by bias and superstition, right? I want or believe that a group of stimuli should have the same result, so I'm going to enter into an interaction with a new system, assuming that's the case. Right? And our mental models, obviously, we carry them forward from one system to the next. I always expect search to be in the upper right and changing the size of windows or closing windows to be in the top left. Right? That's part of our standard mental model these days. Okay. What can we do as we're designing our system to help our users build up an appropriate mental model of our system? We've kind of talked about some of these things already. What can you do to make this overall process of building up mental models easier? Sometimes it's easier to think about it the other way around. What are some systems that make it very hard to build up an understanding of what's going on under the hood?
Visualizations
What kinds of visualizations help?
that represent what the program wants the user to do.
Okay. Absolutely. So we can use visualization. Yep.
And those conventions that have been established for long periods of time, if they change, then that breaks.
Then we're in
previous
trouble.
mental models.
Exactly, right? So I expect that if we're using color, that red means stop or close or pause or record. Green means play or forward or more or bigger or something like that, right? Red and green have very general connotations, but there are still specific connotations for those particular colors, right? So we're carrying across conventions. Can we be more specific? So let's focus on visualizations. What can you draw to help people understand the basic assumptions you've made about the system? Groupings of functions, how things are organized in the system. Yes?
Well, if you kind of like navigate down like a menu hierarchy, you could do an animation that shows like, a page turning that way, and if you go up a level of the hierarchy, it will flip back over there or something.
Okay, so you're going down through the hierarchy and flipping forward through pages and flipping back. All right, so a visualization that says you're going forward, you're going back, or you're going down to more detail or up to more global functions. We're going to talk about navigation of information spaces in a couple weeks, which is this idea about navigating, right? Where am I and where am I going? Am I going deeper into the guts of the system, or am I coming back out towards the root of the hierarchy or the first page or the start of the level or what have you? Here's some more tricks. And again, these are kind of examples of visual metaphors that we've kind of talked about before. Maybe you group buttons or interaction widgets together if they have similar function, right? A visual metaphor says there's something about the spatial distribution of things, and that spatial relationship is supposed to be a reflection of a conceptual relationship. So button 1 and 2 trigger the same response or similar response, or they correspond to some similar function. Maybe things that the user uses most often you make big or easy to click on or most visible, and things that they do very rarely or things that might be potentially dangerous, you make them small, you put them out of the way, you make it hard on purpose to trigger that function. Okay. Physical proximity implies conceptual proximity. Size implies common or safe functions. Give me another visual metaphor along this line. What else? How else could we play with things that we draw on the screen to advertise the functionality of the system? So if I see that I'm using this big button all the time, I kind of get the idea, right? In this system, things that are big or easily clickable are things that I'm going to be doing a lot of the time. I hope that visual metaphor will be consistent across the system. Yeah?
I don't know if it's quite right, but like graying out something that they don't yet have access to or can't yet.
Graying out, right? A common one. It's hard to see, which means it's hard to do, right? Or impossible to do for the present moment. Yeah, that's a common visual metaphor that we're used to these days. Okay, so what are we doing when we're helping to build up this mental model? We're providing a system image. You'll hear this term a lot in HCI and in industry. System image is not about the image that the system is presenting, but it's all of the things together. So the user interface itself, its style, it's how the system works, the documentation. There's a general idea there, and the general ideas in this system image should be consistent throughout, right? So the system image of Google and all of Google's things that they have now, Maps and Scholar and what have you, they all have something in common, which is keep it simple, right? Until you do something, you'll be presented with a blank screen or a simple map or something else. And then when you put something in, now you're going to get a lot more information. That's kind of the system image. If I was to try and describe the system image of Google, that's it, right? Minimal until the user does something. Okay, so let's switch now to lecture 10, and we're going to start to tackle some of these aspects of human cognition. As I mentioned on Tuesday, as we work our way through this section on cognitive psychology, we started with things that are relatively easy to pin down, like mental models. You know your user is making a mental model if they make successful predictions, right? They find novel function the first try. Right? So we can measure relatively easy whether your user is building up a mental model or not. Measuring whether they're remembering your system or paying attention to the things you want them to pay attention to in the system. Are they actually perceiving the things you want them to perceive? These are now going to get harder to measure. Not impossible, but a little bit harder. Okay, so just crash course. Most of you know what these are because you have them, right? Memory is kind of a noun. I have a memory of something, talking about a thing, a noun, and it's a process, right? Memorizing. I'm in the process of trying to create a memory, or remembering, pulling a memory back. We've already talked a little bit about recall and recognition. Remember when I showed you the two cartoons next to each other and you had to find the differences? You found it hard because recall is hard. You have to remember how many strawberries there were on the cake when you saccade or move your eyes to the cake in the other cartoon and count the strawberries. The moment I overlaid the two cartoons and went back and forth, you're recognizing or attending to change. There was something there, now it's not there. It's flickering back and forth. There's a change there. Okay. People talk about working memory and long-term memory. We already are in dangerous territory because I've now defined two classes, working memory and long-term memory. Do you have two separate memory systems running up here? Nobody knows. But it's easy to talk about things that happened today that you remember and things you remember from your childhood. Okay. Attention, people usually use metaphors for this, right? It's a lighthouse. You have a beam of attention and you can direct it. You can consciously direct it at things, or it can be captured by an external event, and it's hard for you to pull away from that to some other thing you'd like to pay attention to. Okay. We're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about perception, and I'm going to distinguish perception from sensory stimulation or sensation. So as long as your eyes are open, you can't help photons falling on your retina. That's sensation. You're picking up stuff visually. Perception is what does your brain do with that information, right? Do you perceive in that chaos of photons a person you recognize, something that's unfamiliar, who knows? And building up this perception is an active process. Your eyes are always saccading and jumping from one part of the visual field to another. You're actively trying to construct or pull meaning out of your sensory stimulation. And a lot of the time, you're using these perceptions to prove or disprove mental models. There's a car that's approaching me at a very fast velocity. Right? You're building up a mental model. What do you do about it? Okay. The body moves to actively generate these perceptions, right? So photons passively fall on the eye. That's a passive process. But if one of your faces is occluded that I can't quite see it, I move so that I can see you, right? John Dewey. Motor first, sensory repercussion after. Okay. This is my favorite slide for a warning about thinking, right? So it's misleading. You don't have a memory module in your brain. You don't have a perception module. You don't have an attention module. It's a very famous and incredibly controversial study that got at this question. Has anybody heard of the Libet study before? For some people, it's incredibly depressing. For others, quite the opposite. Okay. I choose to push against the monitor, and I push against the monitor. I have free will. I chose to do something, and then I did it. We all have free will. I don't know where it is in the brain, but it certainly feels like I have it, and there's no evidence to the contrary, right? We're all free to choose something and then do it, but are we really? I'm going to just talk you through a little bit of the details. They're not important for this course, but they're really interesting. In this experiment, they invited a bunch of human participants into the lab. They were instrumented with EEG so that the experimenters could pick up electrical activity, at least on the surface of the brain and a little bit into the brain. They also put an EMG sensor, an electromyography sensor, on the fingertip so that they could measure contraction of muscles in the finger. These participants were invited into a room. They were asked to look at a clock, and there was a moving red dot that moved around the surface of the clock. And they were asked at any time they wanted to decide to move their finger. When they made that decision, they had to actually move their finger. So you couldn't cheat by thinking, I'm going to move my finger and then not move it, assuming everybody agreed to that and followed those instructions. They were also asked to remember exactly where the red dot was. So they were reporting back to the investigators when they actually decided to move their fingers. And the data suggested that most people were following these instructions because at a particular point in time when the participants decided to move their finger, 200 milliseconds later, the EMG sensor registered the beginning of contraction of muscles in the finger for them to move their finger. Okay, so far, so good, right? We still have free will. Whew. Okay, this is the disconcerting part. They looked at the EEG patterns or the electrical patterns in the brain of the participants at the moment in time when they decided to move their finger. And the pattern was obviously different for every subject, but there were particular patterns that were consistent for the same subject if they did this a bunch of times. So if I was in the lab and I was wearing the EEG helmet here and I did this 20 times, they had the EEG data for 20 points in time, which were the 20 points in time when I decided to move my finger. And there was some pattern in my brain that was consistent at that time, and that pattern did not show up the rest of the time that I was wearing the EEG helmet. So there's a certain pattern in my brain that forms and then dissipates at the moment when I decide to move my finger. So that looks good, right? That's the decision being made somehow. Turns out, though, that there is another pattern that also associates with that pattern that would show up 300 milliseconds before I decided to move my finger. And that pattern was always there 300 milliseconds before I decided to move my finger, and it wasn't there when I didn't. Is that troubling? You all seem okay with this? Has anyone talked about this paper in a psych class or a philosophy class? Can we recover free will from this experiment? Seems that it's unconscious, right? I thought I moved my finger at this time, but unbeknownst to me, somewhere in my brain I had already made the decision 300 milliseconds earlier. But if I wasn't aware of it, who made the decision to move my finger, right? Things get very problematic very quickly. All right, I'm not trying to disprove that we all have free will. You can take these results as you wish, but it certainly starts to, hopefully it makes you question one of our most obvious assumptions that you have free will. You choose to do something and you do it. Right? Okay, so if you remember something or you paid attention to something or you perceive something, did you really? What does it mean? It's often quite misleading. So just keep that as a warning as we talk about these mental processes. Again, if you read a psychology textbook or a neuroscience textbook, they'll often talk about these cognitive processes as separate things. Of course, they're not separate. They're probably not separate in the brain, and they're not separate in terms of behavior, right? There are very fundamental interactions between memory, attention, and perception. I can only remember things that I perceive. If I don't perceive it, I can't remember it. Changes in attention. As I change my attention, I perceive something different, which means I remember something different. Our memories shape our perceptions. what we remember actually can influence what we think we see or what we think we hear. And in the interest of time, I'll let you think on your own about these other interactions between these three cognitive processes. Okay. So again, we already have to be careful. These are not separate things. Okay. So this is the great thing about talking about these processes. You get to try them out. So we're going to do a little experiment here. Take out a piece of paper and a pen if you don't already have one. And we're going to play a couple of memory games. Okay, we're on slide 4. If you have the slides in front of you, don't cheat by looking at slide 5 when we play this game. If you've already looked at it already, try and forget. All right, I'm going to flip to the next slide, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds to memorize all the numbers that are there. I'll do that for 10 seconds. You're not allowed to write anything during those 10 seconds. At the end of the 10 seconds, I'll flip to the next slide, which is blank. And that'll be your cue to then write down as many numbers as you remember. All right, here we go. Okay. Okay, we good? A couple people are still writing. I'm impressed. Okay. How many numbers did you get right? How many people got at least one number right? Hopefully. Keep your hand up if you got at least 2 numbers right. 3 numbers right. 4 numbers right. 5 numbers right.
I got the series.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, not whether you got 5 right, but how many numbers you remembered. How many people remembered it and wrote down at least 6 of the numbers? At least 7 of the numbers? At least 8 of the numbers? At least 9? 10? Good, okay. 10, 11? 11, 10? Okay, 11, not too bad. Okay, we're going to play the same game, different set of numbers. You're also going to get 10 seconds. Here we go. Get ready. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay, how many people got at least one number right? Oh, thank you. How many do I remember? I don't know. Okay. How many people got at least one number right? At least, good, okay. At least 2 numbers right? 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, we're already doing better than last time. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people that remember 11. 12 numbers. Good. 13. 13 numbers. Okay. You can all guess how this is going, right? Now, obviously, this exercise becomes less relevant every year because who memorizes telephone numbers anymore, right? At some point, I'm going to have to stop using these slides, but you guys still remember what these things are, right? Okay. So why? Why is it easier? It's easier because you got to do it twice, but they're not the same numbers. Sorry? Grouping, right? So they're grouped together. They're not just grouped together. They're grouped together in a particular way.
Phone numbers kind of have like a rhythm when you say them.
They have a rhythm because hopefully you had to at some point remember numbers, right? I'm 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? The brackets and the dash, it's all something that's familiar that served as a scaffolder to help you remember numbers back in the Stone Age when you actually had to remember numbers. So what I want you to take away from this is, again, if somebody has to remember stuff about your system, or they want to remember stuff about your system, the way you present it can greatly influence how successful they're going to be at remembering things. You can group things. That's a common technique known as chunking from the psychology literature, right? Breaking things up into manageable chunks. How much can you remember before you need to repeat it and reinforce it? At least some of our brains have practice and are wired up to remember telephone numbers. There's something about the rhythm of it that's familiar that helps. Structural chunking, fancy word for just saying that we can not just group things together, clump them together, but clump them together into hierarchical things, right? So, again, there's controversy about this. I tend to believe that people have an easier time of remembering material that's organized hierarchically. That's why I break this course into 6 themes. Within each theme, there's 4, 5, or 6 set of lecture notes. Within each one of those, there's a dozen or so slides, and so on. So if you want to remember where we first talked about visual metaphors, hopefully you can have an easier time remembering them than if I had given you a flat deck of 200 slides at the beginning of the course, right? All right, let's talk about short-term or working memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory, very limited capacity, right? We just saw an example of that. Very hard to hold a bunch of things in memory until they've been reinforced, right? Until you've written it down 10 times, or you've said it out loud, or you've had a chance to sleep, and your brain has incorporated it into long-term memory. Hard to hold on to something without it being hard to hold on to a lot of things before they're reinforced. Long-term memory, kind of interesting. There's been some really cool psychology experiments, which we won't go in today. There's an experiment where a professor flashed a slide like this and didn't talk about it to a group of students. 30 years later, he called them back and asked them some questions, and it turns out a lot of the students subconsciously remembered what was on the slide. They couldn't consciously tell the professor what was on the slide, but by asking the right questions, he could determine that these students had remembered something that they'd seen for half a second 30 years later. So, is long-term memory actually virtually unlimited? Who knows, right? Hard to imagine an experiment where we could test that you remember every second of your waking life. There's an interesting statistic that in most human brains, there's about 10 to the 11 neurons and 10 to the 14 synapses. It's a big number. Most humans, at least up to this point, live for less than 10 to the 14 seconds. So if every synapse recorded something from 1 second of your waking life, and of course the brain doesn't work that way, it's a very crude approximation, you could in theory encode sensory stimulation from every second of your waking life. Now, whether you could bring it back and use it, who knows? Kind of interesting. Okay, most of us, however, focus on the more pressing need to just take whatever we've just learned and put it into long-term storage to be able to at least bring it back tonight for the quiz. There's no final exam in this class, so you're off the hook for holding on to it until the end of the semester. All right, I'm sure you've all heard this in study guides. How do you actually, what are the strategies for remembering things? The main point here is to use as many of your different sensor modalities and also your muscles, movement, to remember things. You might internally rehearse things with your inner voice. If you read to yourself out loud, subvocally, it's been shown that you remember things a lot more than just reading them without subvocalizing it, right? Writing things out. There's a reason why I ask you to actually physically write things on the slides, on paper, or at least on the screen. You often remember things by remembering the movements that produced it. I don't know if in high school they still have the combination locks that spin left and right. A lot of people long after high school, myself included, I can't remember what the 3 numbers were, but if you gave me that lock, I could probably open it. Somehow it's in muscle memory, but it's not in conscious recall. Okay. The more sensor modalities you bring to bear, the more likely you are to remember it, right? Read something, read it out loud to yourself, have somebody else read it to you, watch a visualization of it, watch an animation of it, and so on, right? Reinforces the memory. If you're trying to throw away the details but remember the inner concept, restructure things, right? So I've given you lots of examples of robots and people and things to give you insight into this idea of mental models. Doesn't matter to me whether you remember the details of the evil starfish experiment, but I want you to understand what the concept of a mental model is and how you might build one, right? So we try and come at it from lots of different ways to get at it. Okay. Related to this is the brain is not just a prediction machine, but it was the original autocorrect. I'm sure you've all handed in essays where you were sure there were no spelling and grammatical mistakes. You read it 10 times, and it comes back covered in red ink. The book that I wrote with my advisor, 300 pages, we had to make sure there were no spelling or grammatical mistakes in it before it went out. We were just about ready to send it to the publisher, and a friend had a look and said, "Oh, you've got a spelling mistake on the first page." Right? The brain, I'd read this book, this manuscript so many times, I could not find the errors anymore. We talked to the publisher. They said, lock yourself in a hotel room with your with the co-author. One of you take the manuscript, read it out loud, and the other person have the manuscript and read it while hearing the other person read it, but read it back to front. Read the last sentence of the book, then the second last sentence, then the third last sentence. It was one of the most brutal experiences of my life, but hopefully, if you read the book, there's no bloody spelling mistakes in that book, right? So often you're trying to remember, but often you're trying to break your brain's ability to predict or autocorrect, right? Okay. We've already talked about this a fair bit, right? Recognition is kind of easier for people than recall. If that's true, why do command line interfaces still exist? Why do people use Linux, which has a blinking cursor and not much else, right? If you're a power Linux user, you're doing everything based on recall. In HCI, there's a tongue-in-cheek acronym here for WIMP interfaces. Anybody know what WIMP stands for? Windows, icons, menus, and pointers, right? So basically a GUI, right? So a GUI usually is predicated on the idea that there's some visual cue there at the top saying there's a bunch of functions. And by now, I know that those project an affordance that if I clicked on any of those words, there'd be more functions, right? Here's a graphical user interface that's showing me, so I don't have to remember that there's a group of functions around the idea of formatting the text. I can just see it. I recognize it. I don't need to recall it. So how have Linux or command line interfaces persisted?
Significantly faster.
Why?
Because if you know how to do something, you can just do it quickly without having to click things.
Absolutely, right? So if I want to find a functionality here, I have to saccade around and look for it, which doesn't take that long, but it starts to add up, right? If you're a Linux user, you remember and you type it in and away you go, assuming you're not trying to remember what the command is, right? We're also going to talk about attention in a moment, right? The cost of relying on recognition over recall is that I have to draw things, right? There's a lot of things on the screen. Luckily, none of them are blinking, right? But there's stuff there that's cluttering up the screen, right? There's a beauty in an empty terminal window that has nothing other than the cursor. You can focus on what you're doing. Okay. So recognition requires that you present something, but how much do you present? You want to present as little as possible so that the user recognizes or understands the affordance that you're trying to project, but not too much, right? You confuse the user. how much should you present for different users? Maybe you have a dynamic interface, right? Things get very complicated very quickly if you're trying to obey this law of cognition that most people find recognition mentally easier than recall. Okay. Let's talk about attention for a moment. This one is one of the least understood of all the cognitive processes. There's this debate that goes back and forth about is it better to multitask or unitask, right? Used to be that computers allow us to do multiple things at once. Seems that we're not very good at doing multiple things at once, and now there's sort of this backlash where we should be rewarding people that unitask rather than multitask, right? Can we actually attend to multiple things at once, or at least rapidly switch our attention between lots of things at once, right? What's the right way to do this? Okay, there's a huge literature in psychology about what attention is, and as you can imagine, one of the oldest models in the literature is single channel. Attention is a lighthouse, and the beam coming out of the lighthouse is your attention, and you're waving that beam over things in your environment. As the lighthouse keeper, you can control where that beam goes, but again, there can be external events that grab your attention away from you. Not surprisingly, in the 80s, when computers were becoming more and more common, people started to come up with attention models that look like metaphors for computers. You have a certain amount of attention that's like processing power, and you can choose to allocate more or less of it to certain things. Hopefully, you're dedicating most of your attention to my voice at the moment. You're probably also allocating a little bit of it to the slide up there or the slide down there. You're probably allocating a little bit to the clock up there and keeping track of how many minutes we have left till class finishes. Maybe a little bit about what you're going to do after class and so on and so forth, right? You're allocating these things, and I'm doing my best to make sure I capture most of it. Okay. Controlled and automatic processing, again, this idea that you can consciously control some of it, but a lot of it is also unconscious. And that seems kind of obvious, right? Again, whatever attention really is, it's probably some combination of all of these things. These models are just ways of trying to batten down attention so that we can try and understand it and figure out if I show this interface, people seem distracted. If I show this interface, I'm able to hold their attention for longer, and so on. Okay, I'm going to have to maximize this slide. Okay, how is attention actually switched from one stimuli to another? As I talk you through this slide, you're going to be pulled every 10 seconds or 5 or 10 seconds to the animated GIF in the top right. Don't pay attention to it. Okay. Internally, we make a choice to attend to something else. Externally, a stimulus causes us to switch our attention. What causes you to switch attention is context dependent. So I don't have this slide, but if actually there were a huge amount of these animated GIFs all around the edge of the slide, you'd be better able to pay attention to the text in the middle, right? Most of the stuff on the slide is not moving except one thing. There's one exception that keeps jumping out at you, right? So what else are you drawing to the screen that's helping or hindering attention, right? If things are relatively consistent, there's not much that I need to do to draw your attention to some subset of what I'm showing. This is obviously kind of whited out here because of the contrast. I wanted you to pay attention to this, but the beamer here is working against me. It's something that's in light gray and all caps and underlined and italics and bold and so on, right? The more stuff that's going on the screen, the harder you need to work to capture the user's attention, and the more tired they're going to be after interacting with your system. So a lot of HCI genius has to do with this idea, right? Everything is very simple. And when your attention needs to be drawn to something, only one part changes. Remember that when you're creating your ASL system. Okay, let's play another game. Again, don't cheat. if you have slide number 16 ahead of you. I'm going to show you a whole field of uppercase E's, and hidden in it is one uppercase F. I promise you the F is actually there. I wouldn't be that cruel. All right, let's see how long it takes you to find the F. Go. You see it? Okay. Hands up when you see it. Okay, I think we're there. All right, so hopefully you were attending to the field of ease. I was watching you as you put up your hands. There was huge variance. Someone found it almost immediately. Some of you, it took a fair while. That's okay, right? Why huge variance in this particular perceptual task? Again, the beamer is working against us here. It's blurring out the ease a little bit.
Eyesight can definitely be a factor.
What's that?
Eyesight.
Eyesight, yes, exactly. So some of you in the back, you have a good excuse.
We started scanning.
And where did you start scanning?
Started bottom right.
I did trick you, and that was a good place to start. Where did you go from the bottom right?
That's exact backwards.
Ah, okay. You're on the right track, right? So if you did start in the bottom right, and you scanned zigzag, how else did other people scan this image? Were they aware of it?
I just tried to look at the bottom of all the E's.
Good, okay, so actually attend to subsets of the percepts. So percept means just a little perception, a little thing that you're paying attention to, which in this case are the uppercase E's. What were some other strategies you employed?
I started on the left and was looking at the column.
Why were you looking at the columns? I imagine most of you were scanning the columns. I do whenever I play this game, even though I know I shouldn't be doing so.
They're closer together, and you can kind of see, like, just looking down, you can see all the parts of the E's that come out.
Okay,
So if there's one missing, it would be more apparent.
okay.
And you've got a better reference of other elements in each column as opposed to going by each row.
Okay. All right. You know the game. We're going to play it again. Be ready. Find the F. Oops.
Well,
Sorry, cheating. Find the F. Aha, you've cottoned on to this now, right? Okay, how did I try and fool you in this case? You can see I put the F in a particular position to try and make this hard, but I didn't fool you the second time around. Why not?
They're all the one E line up, so when it's very different data, you can see what it is.
Okay, hopefully that helped. I probably could have been a little more clever and moved the E's apart a little bit so that percept wasn't as obvious. Why else did I put the F there?
Probably because the typical scanning strategy would be top to bottom.
Top to bottom. Why top to bottom?
It's the way we read.
Sorry?
It's the way
It's the way we read, right? So without priming, most people will start at the top left and scan the top row, second row, so on. If the E's are organized in columns, and if you're a native English speaker, you'll start at the top left and scan the columns rather than the rows, right? You could scan the rows here, but it's difficult. Why? Exactly, right? So I can make this task easier or harder by the actual spatial distribution of things, right? So if I'm trying to help the user find the F, and maybe you're not creating an interface like that, but whatever the goal is, even with the same amount of ink, right? So it's not just a matter of drawing too much stuff to the screen and distracting the user. With the same amount of ink, we can still do a better or worse job of supporting the user as they try and perceive things, or as they try and maintain attention on the thing we want them to pay attention to, or helping them remember this thing, because the next time they come back to the system, we're not going to show it and allow them to recall it. Right? So the way we draw things can also influence perception. I mentioned this before. There's some cool HCI studies out there where participants wear eye tracking software, and you actually watch where they look. This is sometimes used for website design, assuming this is probably someone who speaks English or a Romance language. The size of the circle is, I think, the amount of time that they spent there, and it's hard to see here, but there's arrows that kind of show where they went, and it's usually something like this, coming back here to verify something, going here, coming back to verify, coming back to verify. They're scanning this sort of inverted Z back and forth, but also jumping around to try and prove or disprove the mental models they're building up of what's in these 4 pictures and groupings of text. Okay. We went through that pretty quick. I don't have lecture slides 11 with me, so since you worked so hard on these optical illusions, we'll finish a few minutes early today. We'll start in with lecture 11 on Tuesday. You have a quiz due tonight. Continue working on deliverable 4, and we will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you. Yes.
A quick problem.
Sure,
I
no
think
problem.
it's kind of a quick fix, but
Sure.
when I run.
Here, why don't you put your computers on? That's entirely possible. The other thing to do is to just try and install Skype. Just try and install
I haven't started it. I'm gonna get home and
actually, you know what? It should be. I'm pretty sure it's there. It may just not know where to look for it. So I would try installing scikit-learn, and if it still can't see it, basically you can just copy the scikit files into the directory where your code is running. All right, that's the easiest thing. All right, give that a go. The teaching assistant is around tomorrow, so if that doesn't work, great. Okay, good luck.
Thanks.